Hey comrades, it's Max, the Communist Fox, here with another Creepypasta video for you. In today's video we will be looking at the next couple chapters of Concordant Calamity, Chapter 3, Reservations Cacophony Gold and Chapter 4, Repartition Cacophony Silver. This has been a thrilling story so far and I'm excited to continue. As always, if you have a request, feel free to comment it down below. Don't forget to like, subscribe and comment what your favorite part was. Now, onto the intro. Chapter 3, Reservations Cacophony Gold. As Red lay there he started to feel uncomfortable. Something was lurking around the room. He could feel it watching his moves. Unsure of where his Pokemon were, he had no defense against whatever it was, so instead of getting out of bed and running he resorted to sticking the blanket over the top of his head. It was silent until a bell rang, loud enough that it must have been in the room. He held his breath and willed or whatever it was to leave them be, but it rang again, even closer this time. By the time it rang for a third time, Red was unable to hold his breath any longer, gasping and coughing. Whatever it was must have noticed him once more and this time made a move, flinging the blanket off of them and lifting up a lamp with some kind of telekinesis. In the split second he caught the Pokemon in view, he was able to figure out what it was. It was an Unown. Before he could analyze it, however, the lamp collided with his temple hard enough to snap out his consciousness. Through the depths of unconsciousness he could still numbly feel himself getting dragged around and out of the hotel room. It was going to be a long day for him when he finally awoke. Well, we've checked everywhere on my map, we've asked everyone we came across and there's still no sign of Silver. Maybe we should visit Professor Realm. He might know where Silver is. Why would he? It's worth a try even if he doesn't. Ethan shrugged. He was holding the Gengar's hand. He had been since leaving the hotel, using it as a guide since he couldn't see anything himself. Well, where is he? Where are we? I can't draw Pokemon. Angry Gengar and scared Hypno. Oh right, Caleb checked the map and read off where they were, having a look on the map to see if he could pinpoint the location of Elm's lab. That's all the way in Johto. Ethan, where did you last see Silver? Where did I last see Silver? Oh Ethan bit the inside of his bottom lip, trying to remember. As they stood around inside of tall grass, a rustle began, stalking its way over. There you two are, Blue called out, hopping off Rodactyl and straight onto the rustling grass. An angered Hypno leapt out and instantly used Hypnosis on the three. Silver's Gengar glared at the Hypno and chased it as it retreated. Being lower level than the own Pokemon, inside of the Hypnosis the three were dreaming of the same thing, the dream originating from Ethan, but seeping into the minds of the other two. It was a horrible, rainy day which caused the mud of the playing field to be slippery enough that Pokemon moves would often miss despite how accurate the Pokemon was usually or was meant to be. Silver had been battling Ethan after Ethan had asked ever so kindly. He used Feraligatr's Crunch, but instead of hitting Ethan's Pokemon, the Feraligatr had slipped and fell past the Pokemon, instead snapping its fangs through Ethan's right arm. Ethan had cried out as his arm was crunched off, his bones snapping and flesh tearing off, filling the Feraligatr's mouth with human blood. Silver had been so shocked he couldn't even speak. After all, he hadn't intended for Ethan to be maimed by any of the attacks since he himself wasn't Silver's target, especially not in this battle. Hold still, idiot, Silver grumbled as he removed Ethan's jacket. It was undamaged since the sleeves had been rolled up, but it was still in the way. Tossing it aside, Silver asked for Ethan's shirt. Ethan was in so much pain that he didn't care, helping Silver remove it. Silver then used the shirt as a tourniquet if sunken, stopping the blood that was draining from the shredded stump of bone and flesh. Ethan was crying and Silver couldn't help but feel guilty. After all, this wasn't what he had wanted. The wound's appearance was gruesome and the image would be stuck in his mind for a long time. Ethan was clinging to Silver and for once Silver wasn't angry at Ethan, instead letting him hold on to him. This was Silver's fault after all and it was the least he could do. Ethan wasn't angry at Silver despite this. but he was confused as to why Silver didn't take him to a professional to patch him up. Nevertheless, he weakly thanked Silver. He just huffed and kept pressure on the wounded arm. They stayed like that for a while. Silver's Feraligatr had swallowed the lemon Silver had told it to return back to his Pokeball. It did so. After what seemed like hours, they finally moved, Silver helping Ethan up as Ethan cried again in pain. Luckily the blood had stopped and he wasn't bleeding out. Silver had asked him if he wanted to go home. When Ethan had nodded his head, Silver nodded his own and took Ethan back home, leaving them a few steps from his house before dashing off, leaving Ethan alone. Making his way to his door, he knocked and smiled when his mother opened it, looking surprised at first, then shocked at the fact her son was missing his right arm. Crunchy Ethan losing his arm. She ushered him inside and he giggled lightly as he sat down. He felt dizzy and uncomfortable. Float even. He decided to close his eyes and before long he had passed out. When he awoke, he was in bed. His arm was cleanly cut and wrapped. After the few days of recovery, he was back at Pokemon training. He had managed to run into Silver again. Nothing seemed off other than Silver seeming more quiet and careful around Ethan when they interacted. A long time had passed and Ethan was walking through Route 46, he had caught a few Pokemon, but what made him pause amongst all grass was the sight of Silver, who was wobbling as he walked, one hand pressed to his face. Ethan ran over, calling out to him. Silver didn't even make an effort to turn, instantly throwing a Pokeball his way and telling Galbat to use Air Cutter. The force sent Ethan flying into a rocky slope. He went to get up, but a pain shot through his right arm, blood spilling from it. The attack had obviously sliced through his clothes and skin. Despite the pain and blood, Ethan sat up and went for a Pokeball, but before he could do so, Silver called out Magneton, telling it to use Spark. At that moment, Silver had turned around and Ethan had caught a glimpse of his face. It was stained with blood. The Magneton rushed its attack towards Ethan, knocked him back down and making him black out, the shock sending a painful jolt through his body. His fingers on his left hand burnt like he had just grabbed the rats inside an oven and his insides felt raw and hot. They felt like they had been skinned and shredded. His throat felt tight and painful and even his eyes hurt. Upon the thought hitting him, he screamed in fear and pain, adrenaline unable to numb his nerves and receptors. He regretted raising his burnt fingers to his eyes when he felt his fingers dip and cave into wet sloppy skin. My eyes. He couldn't process what was happening. It had all happened too quick. Silver had already ordered Galbat to use another Air Cutter. This time it caught Ethan's throat, slicing the off-center wide open. Blood gushing out to mix with the blood slipping down from his face and nose. He couldn't breathe. Everything felt warm. Everything hurt and his thoughts were all fried, yet he cried for Silver to stop and Silver seemed to listen to his order. Ethan was choking on his blood, trying to find a way to sit so that he could breathe, but it wasn't working. He could hear the footsteps and when they stopped he could feel Silver standing just next to him. "I didn't know it was you." Silver's voice sounded strained and broken, like it was being cut up and placed together. "You should have ran." There was sadness in Silver's voice. Ethan tried to stand but was grabbed by the collar of his jacket and carefully pushed down against the rocky sloped surface. Ethan did nothing to resist it, just struggling for breath. Somehow he felt safe, but that changed when he felt one of Silver's hands lightly press on his throat, the other joining in not long after. "Hold the Typhlosion," Ethan holding on to Typhlosion and hiding behind them. "You should have ran, Ethan." Silver sobbed atop Ethan as he pressed even harder on Ethan's throat, cutting off both blood and air. Ethan struggled and kicked, but Silver didn't stop. He continued to strangle him. Ethan could feel himself getting weaker and cried with the last bit of air he had in his lungs, and before he could even try to inhale he had passed out. When he awoke he gasped for air and coughed, holding at his own throat. He could feel a thick Pokemon standing beside him. Leaning against it he figured out it was his Typhlosion, who was helping walk him along. He wanted to thank them but he didn't have the energy. As he was walked along he heard people scream and hid behind his Typhlosion. He didn't know why they were reacting like that, but he then realized that he must be covered in blood still. The sight must have been what was scaring them. A little further along, wherever he was finally greeted by someone. "Huh?" he heard as they turned and could feel their horror. "What happened to you?" Ethan, he knew that voice. They called out their camp and had the Pokemon pick Ethan up and take him to somewhere. He wasn't sure on the new location, but he could feel himself being laid down on a soft bed. He sighed and his Typhlosion nuzzled at his face to comfort him. The man who had helped him had started to remove his jacket and his hat, cleaning the wounds before wrapping them in something. It hurt, but Ethan couldn't find the words to speak, so he stuck to staying quiet. Once his wounds were dressed, he tried his hand at speaking. Blue, he managed. It hurt his throat to speak, and Blue must have known that because he had shushed him and told him to rest. Ethan did as he was told, closing his eye sockets and trying to rest. Blue had spent a few days teaching Ethan how to use his Typhlosion as a guide, though he brought up that Ethan seemed to be quite good at navigating by himself too. He also told him that somehow Ethan had ended up in Lola. It took a few weeks for Ethan to get back to his usual self, but once he didn't need Typhlosion or Blue as a guide and was able to navigate around with skill and precision. Blue was impressed. He even told Ethan that to his face. Ethan had also told him what had happened to cause the injuries, but had trouble telling him the perpetrator's name. Blue had also refused to talk about Red, shutting the conversation down point blank by telling him he was gone. He had been paying for an extra room for Ethan to stay in and had asked him if he wanted to accompany him on a shopping trip. Ethan was more than happy to agree. As they walked, Ethan's bandages were slowly soaking through, becoming stained in fresh blood. It seemed the electricity was still coursing through Ethan, making small jolts and causing blood to leak again. Ethan stopped and Blue stopped too, turning to him. They were in the middle of a shortcut through a forest with a clearing that was rumored to be stained with the legend's blood, according to what Ethan had been told by the people living around the area when he was out exploring and mentally mapping the area with his Typhlosion. "Oh, you need more bandages? Don't worry, I brought some." Blue walked over to him and helped him sit down. Ethan felt him undo the old, wet bandages and heard him put them in a pouch of some kind. He also felt as Blue wrapped the new bandages around his wounds, doing them up tight but not too tight that it would hurt or be uncomfortable. He heard Blue stand but also heard the charging of hoofs. Before he could warn Blue, he heard the older make a noise of pain just as he heard a thud. Feeling a gush of wind flow past him, there was the sound of huffing. That Pokemon was a Tauros and it seemed to have hit something, most likely a tree. "Blue, are you okay?" Ethan asked, looking towards where Blue had been hurt. "I'm fine." He was clearly not fine. The words were pained. Where Ethan got up and felt around, ending up touching the Tauros side. It huffed and returned to a Pokeball. His Pokeball. "Do your Pokemon have a habit of charging on their own?" Blue asked, grunting in pain. "No, they've never done that before." Blue had grabbed onto Ethan's shoulder and Ethan was concerned. "Did Tauros hurt you?" "Just pinned me against a tree. Luckily." Blue chuckled and coughed, swearing under his breath. "Don't lie to me." Blue, he grumbled and gently used his hand to poke at Blue's chest. Just as he touched the wound, he could tell from the feeling of blood and ripped open skin. He had felt his own before after all. Blue grabbed Ethan's wrist and told him to stop. "Did it ram its horns through you?" "Ugh," was the only response Ethan got as his hand was pulled away. Despite the possible severity of the wounds, any attempt to get Blue help was stopped and he found himself sitting next to Blue as Blue coughed, the amount of coughs growing more by the moment, the sound going from dry coughs to blood-soaked after a few minutes. Ethan was tempted to help him, but he couldn't. Blue refused his help and just sat there coughing. The hypnosis had worn off and the three woke up. Callum looked at the two, at Ethan, then Blue, then back to Ethan. Blue was staring at the floor and panting heavily and Ethan was curled up, covering his ear. That wasn't the one pressed to the floor, with his hand. Ethan was panicked, crying blood through the bandages, oxygen hardly reaching his stressed lungs. "Ethan!" Callum leaned over to him and put a hand on his shoulder and gently shook him. Ethan turned to look at him with his bandaged eye sockets and he could feel Callum shudder. "Is that really what happened?" Was this removed?" Blue yells at Ethan. "Why, yeah." Ethan stuttered out. His heart was racing and everything was hurting, like the wounds had been slightly reopened due to the memory. "Blue? Are you?" "Shut up!" Blue hissed and Ethan did as he was told, accepting the help of Callum as he lifted Ethan to sit up. Now that he had seen him for a second time, he had been able to recall how Silver looked in his last interaction with him, though he still lacked the finer details of what he was actually seeing. He could clearly see blood slipping from his eyes, or around his eyes. Those eyes that were purple originally were now mostly white with light hints of purple. Those pupils were glowing red where they should have been black. His nose and mouth also had blood draining from them, and his hair looked slightly messy. There was also a hint of red on his neck, although it was obscured by his collar. Forcing himself to remember the details brought back the phantom sensation of hands on his throat, strangling him. He could feel the black gloves Silver was wearing and could feel the blood or tears hit his face. Ethan cooled felt the bloody tears of his own that started falling as he thought, but he was drawn out of the thought-spiral hug from the Gengar. "Is that your Gengar?" a higher-pitched voice called out, surprising Ethan. Leaf Blue seemed to know who it was. Ethan listened into the conversation as he held on to the Gengar. "No, that's Silver's Gengar." "Silver, his rival. Oh, how come you had him?" Callum asked. Leaf seemed to walk over to the Gengar and Ethan and kneel down to pet the Pokemon. "They were chasing a Hypno which bumped into me. I caught it and it began to lead me over here, so I followed it out of curiosity, wondering if maybe its owner was hurt or something." "Well, they hurt. Especially Blue." "I'm fine, they just hurt." Blue grumbled and got up. Leaf got up too and went over to him. She seemed concerned for him. Ethan guessed that the wounds had bled through Blue's own bandages. "Leaf, sorry," she smiled at him. Ethan could hear the tone shift. "Well, what does this Silver look like?" "Red hair," Ethan spoke up, and everyone seemed to move slightly. They were looking at him. "Whitish purple eyes." Leaf hummed, then spoke. "Does he also have blood under his eyes?" "That would be him. I saw him not too long ago. He was getting beaten up by this girl. I tried to step in, but my Pokemon stopped me." The three men went quiet and the Gengar made a worried noise. Ethan petted. "I'm worried too. Don't worry though. I'm sure he fought her off and got to safety." Ethan was trying to comfort the Gengar, but it wasn't working. Leaf then started to remember a few more details. There was a symbol on the girl's hat. "Maybe if we find out what the symbol was, we can find out who she was. And maybe find Silver." Blue added. "Do you remember what it looked like?" Calum questioned. "No, but I think I caught a photo of it." "Let me see." Leaf was searching through the photos until she found the one she was looking for. The symbol was clear on the hat. She showed it to Callum and Blue, who seemed to not recognize it. "Should we ask around?" she asked, and the two men seemed to nod. Ethan got up after the Gengar had climbed off of him and walked over to the three, holding the Gengar's hand again. Chapter 4, Repartition. Cacophony. Silver. When Red awoke, he found himself on the floor. His face was pressed against hard, cold rock and he was unable to move his arms. There was something tight wrapped around them which cut into his skin every time he wriggled them. Scanning the area when his eye had focused, he was able to see someone inside the area with him. They were sat up against a wall and had their head on their knees. Their red hair was a mess, and if Red focused just a little harder, which hurt his head, he could see them trembling. Silver in the cell, looking at Red. As Red sat up, he made a light noise that seemed to alert the other person, who looked at him. Their face was covered in streaks of blood, some from under their eyes, some from their nose, and some from their mouth. Their eyes were whitish with barely purple glaze, and their pupils were red in the centers. They looked like they had witnessed something awful, and by the looks of it, been through something even worse. They didn't speak as they watched him, they just seemed to be reading his movements. Maybe they were afraid of him. They both sat in silence, just looking at each other. This was no tension or any similar emotion hanging in the air. It was just quiet, and almost comfortable if you ignored the circumstances and setting. Unlike Red, the other person wasn't handcuffed. When they finally made their way over to Red, they crawled over, presumably trying to be as quiet as possible. Red could see their wrists were bloody just under the rim of those black gloves, and their neck also seemed to be soaked in said blood. When he had finally got close enough, he leaned up against Red, their chests pumping. Confused, Red almost pushed him away by wriggling until he felt the other person's fingers poking at the cuffs. "This'll hurt," the other man finally murmured, despite saying that he didn't move the cuffs until Red had nodded. But once he had to go ahead, he grabbed the cuffs and began wringing them back and forth, slicing the metal into Red's skin. He could feel Red press his own face against his shoulder. able to hear the muffled pain noises the older was making. Once the blood had started to overflow the cuffs, they were slippery enough for what Silver needed. He reached one hand back and pulled a small piece of metal out of his pocket and then reached back over and down to the cuffs, sliding the piece over the cuffs and in blood until they found the keyhole. Once it was there, he pressed the metal in and angled it around until the cuffs clinked and came undone when he tugged them off. Leaning back and withdrawing from Red, he had the bloodied cuffs in hand. He looked at them and pulled out the piece, saving it in his pocket as Red looked at his wrists, grumbling in pain as he twisted his hands just so they felt a little less numb. "So you're Red?" he asked, quietly, his voice never reaching higher than a whisper. Red nodded his head and Silver nodded in return. "I heard that you died. Did someone wish you back to life?" Red chewed on his bottom lip. He seemed unable to answer it. Silver sighed and had a faint smile. "You don't talk much, do you?" Red shook his head again and Silver just nodded once more. They returned to silence soon enough. Silver had used the sink in the corner along with the rag to clean the wounds on Red's wrists. Both he and Red winced in tandem as he did so. "Keep the portal pointing right. We don't need to go left. There's nothing there. I've looked." "That's how!" exclamation mark. "Don't give me that. Just find the damn thing. Yes, I know, thank you. Yeah. Bye." The high-pitched voice was accompanied by walking from the outside the cell Silver and Red were in. The two men snapped their gazes in the direction of the accented voice, and when they only rounded the corner, Red seemed to feel more uncomfortable. Standing there with a rotome phone in her hand was Gloria. She seemed to be wearing a frown, but when she noticed the two looking at her, she grinned and it was nothing but malicious. "Red, Silver, you're both finally awake," she chimed in. Silver moved from Red, retreating to the wall he had been pressed against when Red had woken up. "How are you feeling, Red?" She came over to the bars of the cell and Silver seemed to be watching from afar as they spoke. Red could just sense how uncomfortable he was even from that distance. Red just looked at her and she tilted her head. "Not the talking type?" she giggled as Red shook his head. "That's alright. I don't need to hear you talk." Her voice changed from playful to cruel in one swoop, and it wasn't subtle in the slightest. She left the side of the cell and went to the center of the room. From what Red could see, the layout of the room was inside a cave. The area was wide, very open and empty except for the two cells near the entrance area and set opposite themselves. In the middle there was a 3-tier round stage. The first tier was small, just some stairs. The second tier held a few computer screens and large units holding data. There was also a few machines that Red wasn't sure what they did. There were also a few tables with items scattered atop them. On the third row was what seemed to be an altar or a doorway of some kind carved out of rock. From what Red could see, it was surrounded by a metal fence, like it was a building that was still a work in progress. Gloria was checking a wheeling table that sat in between the two cells at the floor of the cave. Red couldn't see what was on it, but from the corner of his eye he could see the way Silver got more alert and scared. Once she was done checking the items over, Gloria wheeled the table close to the cell but kept the table just out of reach from the two locked inside. Gloria with the syringe. "Silver, come here." The coldness of her voice made Red shiver involuntarily. Silver shook his head, though he seemed to be hesitant at doing so. The disobedience clearly upset Gloria, who turned to the table and swiped an item from the table and leant against the bars, the item in hand. It was a syringe full of pearlescent liquid which looked like it was shimmering as the liquid squirmed inside the glass. Silver pressed himself against the wall a little more and looked at Gloria with an expression that read as a "please don't." "I find it funny how you're half blind but seem to know exactly what I'm planning." Gloria's giggle was terrifying. Red was confused. Silver was half blind? Was that why he had blood from his eyes? Gloria seemed to pick up on his confusion and gasped. "Silver," the man name seemed to flinch. "You didn't tell the legendary trainer what happened to you?" Silver shook his head and covered his ears. "I guess I'll have to do that myself," she grumbled and put the syringe down. Instead she grabbed a key and opened the cell, and even though his body told him to run, Red couldn't move. When Gloria threw out a Pokemon to guard the door on her, she stepped over to Silver and grabbed his hair, dragging them across the floor to Red before throwing them onto Red, who easily caught him. Ninetales, use Hypnosis. Before Red could avoid the attack with Silver, he was out cold, along with Silver. As they slept, Gloria grabbed the syringe and reappeared beside the two, stabbing the needle into Silver's neck and injecting the liquid, watching Silver wriggle against the feeling even in sleep. Inside the dream, Silver stood facing Red, both silent as Silver bowed his head, offering his left hand toward Red, who tilted his head before accepting the handshake. The handshake seemed to teleport them elsewhere, back in time from the looks of it. They were standing there, but it was like they were both living the exact moments as Silver. Silver had been hesitant around Ethan since the incident with Feraligatr. He didn't want Ethan to get maimed due to his incompetence again, but the boy just refused to leave him alone, coming over to ask for battles at times that were either awkward or tiring, but Silver never refused them. They were rivals of some kind after all. Every time he saw Ethan, he couldn't help the way his eyes were drawn to the missing limb, and every time it opened a wound in his mind. It hurt, but he wouldn't admit, especially not to Ethan. After a battle, Ethan had looked at the money Silver had gave him. It was a small amount, only around 700, and decided to give it back. Silver had refused to accept it back, but Ethan was insistent. Despite that, Silver set his stern "Hey, keep it," and began to sprint off, leaving Ethan alone. When he had slowed, he was in the middle of an empty route. "Hey, Drainer," someone called out to Silver, and he turned. He was tired and wanted to rest. Hell, he didn't even have any Pokemon to use at this moment. The girl calling to him was waving as she made her way closer, and she had a thick accent. "I can't battle right now. I don't want to battle." Silver tensed at that tone. Something felt wrong about this girl. By the time he realized she had reached a Pokeball, it was too late. He was face to face with a Pokemon he had never seen nor heard of before, pink and blue with a witch's hat. The Pokemon did nothing but distract him as multiple people ran onto the route and grabbed his arms, throwing him onto the grass and pinning him down. The Pokemon moved aside as the girl came back into view. She had a syringe in her hand and that grin was dripping with poison. Silver struggled, but no matter how much he did so, he couldn't avoid the stab of the needle in his neck and the feeling of the foreign liquid running through his veins. Being so powerless made him feel disdain towards himself. "That should be enough. We'll take him." The girl spoke to one of her goons, and they let go of Silver's arm as the rest kept hold, instead stepping their boot into Silver's throat, seemingly enjoying his suffering as he squirmed and choked for air before succumbing to the lack of oxygen and passing out. When he came to, he was in a cold cell. His hands were cuffed and his throat hurt. Looking around, Silver could tell he was in a cave with a bunch of people behind him. Despite how hard he tried, his cuffs wouldn't come undone. Instead, they just created bleeding wounds that stained his sleeves and gloves. One of the people noticed he was awake and called to the girl, "Gloria." "Oh, so he is," she chimed from the top layer of the stages, making her way over to the cell with the other people in tow. "I've heard about how much of a pain your father was," she sighed as she looked and watched Silver struggling with the cuffs still. "I heard that Team Rocket had disbanded for a while, and so I was curious how hard it was to find ex-members and recruit them into something much better. And surprisingly enough, it wasn't all that hard." Silver glared at her and said nothing, still struggling with the cuffs. "Most of these guys hate your guts for one reason or another. It was pretty much a passing requirement." That ice-cold tone shot back and made Silver still, "and I'm willing to let them show you just how much they hate you." Gloria then came to the door and unlocked it, turning to the other people in the room and telling them he was a free rein. Silver tried his best to get up and make a run for it, but he ran straight into one of the ex-members, being grabbed and held by the front of his clothes for a moment before being tossed into the back wall, the force winding him. There were about 30 or so people, angry people who either wanted him dead or near enough. There was a system to it all. Everyone got their punches and his was in, making sure everyone had an opportunity to disrespect their ex-boss's son before the more loathful people stepped forward. Silver could taste their hatred more potently than the blood in his mouth. Gloria had snapped a metal chain around his throat and yanked him against the bars, just to make sure he wouldn't be able to avoid him. One of them had asked Gloria for something sharp and sliced open the bottom separator of Silver's nose, the blood quickly dripping down the center of his lips. Another had grabbed that knife and threatened to cut Silver's hair. When that didn't get the reaction they had hoped for, instead they grabbed Silver by the jaw with their free hand and held him in place as they slowly and precisely cut moon shapes on his bottom eyelids, pressing so hard that the blade pierced into the eyeballs, and Silver's scream made the less brutal of the lot shudder. The final person wasn't going to be quick. Instead of just inflicting a punishment onto Silver, they toyed his flesh with a knife, like a hunter nibbling the corpse of its recently caught prey to figure out which areas would be prime for their first feast. Silver glared at the person in front of him. Even with his bleeding eyes and blurry vision, they seemed to find it entertaining as they slowly ran the blade down his cheek and side of his neck before settling for the center once the chain was removed. Every few seconds they made a small slice into his throat, drawing out the pain Silver felt. Silver couldn't help the small sobs that escaped him. It hurt, and somewhere in the pain-hazed fog inside his head he was for some reason calling to Ethan, begging him to stop them. Was he really this weak? The final small incision was made and the person limped back to appreciate the look on Silver's face. As they stepped back, Silver hung his head, tears of salt mixing with tears of blood. He was quiet except for his trembling sobbing. It seemed that the people hadn't had enough just yet, as one of them returned and dragged him to the center of the cell and encouraged the others to join in as they delivered a kick to his ribs, and quickly they did so, everyone seemingly trying to get a kick in as the incisions in Silver's neck started to split open further, blood starting to gush out. Enough, Gloria demanded, and the torture stopped. Silver was choking on his own blood as he split the crowd apart and demanded one of the audience give her their abra. Silver could hear her command the Pokemon, and before he knew it he was somewhere else. He stumbled and fell, landing as a heap on the floor. There was no one else around, he was sure of it. The lonely gust of wind told him so. He couldn't stop the gut-wrenching, blood-full sobbing that left him. He was scared, he was dying, and he was terrified. He was going to bleed to death in the middle of a route with nothing to his name. He was going to die before proving he was a powerful trainer. He wasn't going to have the chance to battle Ethan again. He coughed out broken sobs and blood as he weakly fumbled around, pulling out Gengar's Pokeball and throwing it, having trouble ordering it to use Curse. Luckily the Gengar understood, using Curse on Silver and allowing the wound on his throat to loosely seal up. The Pokemon returned as Silver got up. He was so confused and weak, wobbling as he got up and made his way around the route, one of his hands feeling the way while the other was pressed to his face. There was so much blood and it was still flowing. He wanted to feel some kind of safety again. What the hell did it even mean? On other thoughts, he was starting to hope that maybe Ethan would show up and guide him along, taking him to a place where they can patch him up and help him recover. Ethan would sit by his side, his Pokemon adventure on hold as he sat with Silver and kept him company. Ah, that's the safety he was desperate for. Safety in numbers? No, something else, something more personal. His thoughts were interrupted by something, and without thought he called his Pokemon out and ordered an attack. The barrage hit the object and it cried. He couldn't risk it, not now. He needed to find Ethan. Silver, stop! That voice was his. The guilt sunken in a pit opened up inside of Silver. He made his way over and he couldn't stop the words leaving his mouth. He was gentle with Ethan, laying him down, but as he did so that pit opened its eyes and glared through him, its fangs piercing him and its hands ripping through. He could feel his hands touching Ethan's throat, but he couldn't stop them. He couldn't control them. His hands were warm with fresh blood, Ethan's blood. Yet again he had hurt Ethan. Yet again he was the cause of his suffering. He felt himself choke on air as Ethan cried a final time before seemingly going limp. Silver finally regained control and fell off Ethan. Sobbing out despair, he searched his pocket for another Pokemon, ordering them to teleport Ethan somewhere he could be helped. The Pokemon did as it was told but then returned to teleport Silver elsewhere, carrying him as it did so. His consciousness didn't last long. He didn't even have time to touch the ground before he fainted. When he awoke he heard a familiar voice, Professor Realm. He could barely understand what was being said, but he felt warm. He was wrapped up in blanket and there was no longer the weight of blood on his face. Weakly he looked towards the professor, but everything was a mix of blurred lines and colors, so he just closed his eyes and tried to rest. But inside the darkness of his own eyelids he could envision what Ethan looked like, covered in blood and badly injured. The image was then overtaken by that of the clearer memory of how Ethan looked after the Feraligatr incident. The more he stared at the image in his head, the more it started to turn and twist, distorting into shapes and colors which started gasping for life and crawling towards Silver. His eyes shot open and he felt himself hyperventilate, and was there, patting him on the back. Silver's Pokemon came over and crowded around him. Silver could feel that Talon understood what the Pokemon wanted and moved aside, letting one of them pick up their owner and carry him out of the lab, leaving the blanket in there. The air was cold on Silver's face and he clung to the Pokemon carrying him. He could hear his Gengar and Sneasel talking to Ecother as the Pokemon carrying him, Feraligatr, remained quiet. His Lucozam, Golbat and Magneton soon joined the conversation and Silver had to cover his ears. It was too much noise with no sight and it hurt his head. As the Pokemon continued to walk, Silver thought about what he looked like when he arrived at Tom's lab, but then he decided to shut the thought down, deciding he was more comfortable not knowing. A few days passed of Silver being carried around and kept warm and safe by his Pokemon out in the openness of roots and caves, and then they were all teleported again. To where? Silver didn't know. A few more days later and he found himself walking around the town to try and get used to the setting. The air was warm and he felt like in some way he had recovered, if only the tiniest bit in the most insignificant way. He bumped into someone and apologized, but it was too late. He felt the chill of cruelty ran down his spine and gushed through him like a ghost. He felt sick as they grabbed the front of the outfit he was in. Gloria started to yell at him, making a scene and drawing attention to the two. She made it seem like he was a threat, an ex-Team Rocket member who wanted to steal the Pokemon from the town, and when she got a free hit in, which landed on his right cheek, the group of people cheered, not everyone, but a lot. The free hit turned into plenty of hits and he could feel his wounds reopening, the moons on his eyes leaking blood and his nose dripping it. She took the cheers and applaud and dragged him along. Still too weak to be able to pull free, he was forced to follow her, getting thrown into the cell he had become familiar with after his last visit. This time, he wasn't cuffed. He curled up on the floor and just listened to her plan and held his breath at the mention of the trainer named Red. They snapped awake and Silver withdrew from Red, stumbling backwards, his face soaked with fresh blood. Red silently watched him before offering a hand to him. The cell was void of Gloria, who was now back at the table outside the cell. Silver took the hand and Red gently squeezed it. After that experience he wanted Silver to know that Red wasn't going to hurt him, and that with Red there, he wasn't suffering alone. Silver though was more upset by the fact Red had shown him that compassion. He didn't want Red to be dragged into this. He didn't want anyone to be dragged into this. There's a needle and some thread on the floor between your two, Gloria spoke, still facing the table. You have 3 minutes to sew up one of your mouths. She turned to face him, and if you don't, I'll personally rip out both of your tongues. She showed her hand, which had a pair of clamps and a knife. Red and Silver looked at Gloria, then each other. Red letting go of Silver's hand to pick up the needle and thread. He passed it to Silver, who looked at the needle and thread and shook his head. Red refused to take it back when Silver tried to pass it over. Red, I'm not doing this. Red just gave Silver a glare. It told Silver that he wasn't taking no as an answer, and it chilled him. Silver sighed and prepared the needle, checking it by jabbing his finger through his gloves to see how sharp it was. After the check he began to press the needle into Red's skin. Slowly he threaded it shut. That pit in Silver's chest was snarling again. Red was silent, eyes screwed shut and body tense. Silver finished the job as soon as he could, and once it was done he removed the needle from the thread and put it in his pocket. Gently he tapped Red's shoulder and Red opened his eyes, tears sitting just on the verge of falling. Silver wiped them away with the back of his finger as an apology of some sort. Gloria seemed intrigued and threw a small biscuit packet into the cell. It's for you to share, she giggled and moved the wheeling table to the middle of the cave again, going over to the computer on the stage. Silver opened the biscuits and looked at them, not trusting them, that it would be unfair to eat them after what he just did to Red, so instead he threw them into the corner of the cell and sat beside Red, who held him close with one arm, feeling Silver shivering against him. Inside the cave's entrance area, just a few steps and were Blue, Callum, Ethan and Leaf. Ethan was holding the hand of Silver's Gengar, who seemed to sense that its owner was around here. Callum was at the back of the group, rather scared of what might happen, while Leaf and Blue were at the front of the group, leading the way. Blue and Leaf had managed to find out that the symbol was that a group paired them and that they had to hide out near town. It didn't take long to find Duty Gengar running off towards it when it picked up on its owner, by scent or aura or just some strange super knowledge, no one was sure, but they followed it and sure enough they had found the hideout. No one seemed to be able to tell them what the group were up to, and so they had all agreed to bring any Pokemon they had with them. Unfortunately Calamity had none as they were back at the hotel and Ethan only had his Typhlosion. As they walked, Ethan had fallen behind, only by a few steps, because he had heard something. The Gengar was quietly standing with him, holding his hand still. When Ethan heard the noise again, he felt something claw itself into his back and nest inside him. But the feeling soon faded. It was tingly and he felt something warm inside his chest, but to avoid worrying the others he said nothing. The Gengar however spoke to him, obviously concerned. "I'm fine, just a random shiver." Ethan smiled at the Gengar and continued to walk. The Pocket Tilde copyright Moan didn't seem to believe him as he stared at the purple light emanating invisibly from Ethan's torso.